US policymakers face a new challenge in data security. While Beijing's history of state and quasi-state cyber hacking and illegal data exfiltration has been well documented, policymakers must now grapple with a new challenge, a new set of risks. What happens if Beijing were to aggregate illicitly acquired data with that gleaned openly from available commercial channels? Beijing is already presumed to have sensitive national security information from the theft of personnel records of roughly 21 million individuals from OPM. If location, health, social media, or pattern of life data were to be acquired on the open data market, and combined with that through cyber theft, China could target individuals in sensitive government national security positions, in the military, or those with access to critical infrastructure. Access to large data sets collected abroad also provides Chinese companies with insights into population and individual consumer preferences, risk tolerance, and other indicators. I see this as primarily an economic competitiveness risk that could enhance the market position of Chinese firms beyond China, enabling them to develop AI applications that would better serve diverse demographics. But Beijing could also attempt to push out misinformation to audiences abroad using insights about individual preferences or psychology decision-making trends to help make that misinformation more convincing and more realistic. I'd like to offer recommendations that I believe could create an opportunity to at once address these transnational security threats, but while also advancing a more secure, ethical, democratic, and global internet in its own right in ways that are actually much bigger than China. First, American data will remain exposed so long as restrictions only focus on specific companies from countries that are deemed adversaries. Congress should mandate basic standards for what data can be collected and retained in comprehensive federal privacy law to protect US data regardless of where the risk originates. Without higher standards for data security and privacy that apply to everyone, US personal data and other sensitive data will be more vulnerable to breaches, whether from hackers from China, from companies transferring the data abroad, or from being sold to third parties who openly are buying, aggregating, and selling consumer data with no transparency and no controls. Second, the United States should also work with like-minded governments to develop a common set of standards that would allow data to flow freely. The United States could lead the way in setting up a multilateral certification system that would extend benefits to countries whose data regimes and companies meet certain criteria, perhaps referencing the OECD privacy guidelines. I'd also like to note the potential for the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules Forum, which is a data transfer alliance that requires companies to certify to common standards to enable for cross-border transfers. Third, technical measures to safeguard data should complement these policy efforts. If effectively encrypted, data can be transferred to and shared with even countries that are deemed adversaries. Congress and the administration should work with American companies to develop privacy-preserving technologies, which would allow for computing on data without seeing it, and to implement them in an open source way that would be available for everyone. In conclusion, the United States should put forward a compelling, affirmative vision for US data governance, with higher cybersecurity and privacy standards for all companies, whether domestic or foreign. Inaction will only make the United States less secure, less prosperous, and less powerful, while ceding leadership in defining the rules of the road for technologies that will shape the future to the CCP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Landau.
Chairman Coons, Ranking Member Sass, and other members of the committee, thank you very much for the privilege of speaking with you today. I'm here as the resident technologist, and I'll focus on technology changes that have led us to this juncture. Let me say that China doesn't need to go through the back door to get personal data on Americans. We've opened it up through the front door. Let me explain. In the early days of the web, online advertisers relied on cookies, short text files placed on a user's device that provide long-term records of user activity. But the rise of technology, including smartphones, changed the online advertising business. The industry seeks to do two things: deliver ads and get paid for doing so, and target ads to individuals. Profiling consumers means that users are tracked from the moment they pick up their mobile device in the morning till they lay it down at night. The privacy risks to individuals and the security risks to the U.S. are enormous. I want to start with some history to provide context. When Assistant U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald was investigating the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, he used call detail records to connect suspects' actions. Doing so took him hundreds of hours. A quarter of a century later, this can be done in seconds. This is one of the many changes in the non-content part of communications and related device usage that has caused problems in privacy. The first change, digitization of phone records, made searching communications data, metadata, who called whom when and for how long, easy and fast. The second came from the move to cell phones. Telephone service providers automatically receive information about user locations whenever a phone is on. Later technologies, including GPS and other methods, provide even more precise location information. The third change came from the shift to internet communications, whose metadata is richer than that of phone calls. The fourth, telemetry, streaming data from user devices, provides measurements on device functioning and user activity. This is really useful. It helps manufacturers learn what actions a user took before a device crashed, for example. But sensors on the smartphone, accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnetometers, power sensors, can provide private information about the user, and that data is often shipped off the device. We all know about the data we consciously provide to online sites: addresses where we register for a service, search terms which we type in, photos we upload. It's the data we are unaware of providing that I want to bring to your attention. Users can't control its use, but such data can disclose private information about individuals. For example, even if two users shut off providing GPS location information, device telemetry can reveal they spent the night together. Telemetry can show whether a user is on a bike ride or at a concert. This non-content, metadata, and telemetry can also be used to identify and profile consumers. Asking users to control metadata and telemetry usage off the device doesn't make sense. It's too hard for users to do. There are too many questions, and they can't understand what information might be revealed. The ad industry makes information about individuals remarkably available. Just 2 weeks ago, we learned that one company had been providing businesses sample data on 61 million unique mobile devices. This revealed precise locations of where users had been, including such sensitive locations as reproductive health clinics. For safety and security, we must control the use of metadata and telemetry. Companies should use the data as the telephone company once did, to deliver information, ensure that communications networks work securely and properly, plan for growth, and also for health, public planning, and research in the public interest. I have more details in my written testimony. I recommend that the current bill in front of Congress, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, include protections against the use of metadata and telemetry outside these purposes. As Chris Inglis and Harry Kresger wrote in February, better privacy protections would make it easier for the U.S. to work with the data regimes of like-minded partners. Collaboration would enable deeper interoperability and commercial exchange with countries such as Japan and those in the EU that have already begun laying the foundations of 21st century data law. The resulting international ties would help constrain the spread of Beijing's and Moscow's surveillance technologies. By making Americans' personal data more private, their data becomes more secure. And this, in turn, strengthens our national security. It's a win-win for individuals and for society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pottinger, I believe, is going to testify remotely.
Great. Chairman Coons and Ranking Member Sass and members of the subcommittee, it's a privilege to appear before you today. For years now, Washington's engagement on data issues has been dominated by disputes on Capitol Hill and with our European partners over privacy rules for America's tech giants. But at the same time, there's an even greater data threat from Beijing that's gone largely unaddressed. From his earliest days in power, Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping has made clear that, quote, whoever controls big data technologies will control the resources for development and have the upper hand, close quote. So to the CCP, data is not merely information, it's an instrument that Beijing uses to improve its military capabilities, its surveillance state, and its bid for commercial dominance in the technologies of the future. The personal data that it captures is used to influence and intimidate, to reward and blackmail, and ultimately to divide and subvert. The Biden administration has underscored the importance of data in our competition with Beijing, but so far, no visible American counter strategy has emerged. The result is that China is already beating the United States and its allies when it comes to harnessing data to achieve commercial, technological, and military advantages. So in classifying data as a, quote, strategic resource, Xi Jinping has spent the last decade establishing the laws, regulatory mechanisms, and enforcement leverage necessary to ensure that data in all of its forms is accumulated, controlled, and exploited to advance the strategic interests of his single-party regime. China's prowess in artificial intelligence and Beijing's centralized data regime have been put to use in ways that couldn't be more antithetical to human freedom. Most notably, it has been used to monitor, oppress, and incarcerate millions of ethnic and religious minorities, including the ethnic Uyghur people, which even the United Nations now recognizes as victims of probable crimes against humanity. Beijing wants to export this data-driven surveillance technology and to other autocratic governments around the world. Equally important, Beijing's evolving data regime also advances its key aims of global propaganda, censorship, and influence. Xi Jinping has said that he wants to win a global, quote, public opinion struggle, close quote. He's putting massive resources into enhancing what he calls China's, quote, discourse power. And by discourse power, he means the Communist Party's ability to set and suppress and shape global narratives. And it should concern free societies everywhere that the autocratic regime in Beijing now regulates the AI algorithms that are the secret sauce in Chinese-owned social media apps that are becoming dominant in the United States and around the globe. Beijing is using legal warfare to advance its strategy, aiming to ensure not only access to, but also de facto control over global data flows. First came Beijing's 2017 National Intelligence Law, then two laws passed last year in 2021, the Data Security Law and the Personal Information Protection Law. And together, these laws embody Beijing's demand for unlimited state control over data and the entities that process it, even if they are located overseas. These laws assert Beijing's veto power over foreign governments' requests for data from China, and they criminalize compliance with US or foreign sanctions against China that involve data. The result is that foreign firms operating in China, including many US companies, must not only relinquish control over their data, but must also accept a permanent limbo between US and Chinese laws. So in these cases, US firms can comply with US law, or they can comply with Chinese law, but not both. And this is by Beijing's design. US banks and technology companies operating in China are already feeling the effects of the CCP's digital coercion. So there are several steps the US can take that would strengthen our position in light of Beijing's data strategy. First, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States should do more to block Chinese acquisitions of and investments in US companies with sensitive data. At the same time, the Information and Communications Technology and Services Regime, so-called ICTS, which is run by the Commerce Department, should block data flows that undermine our national security. Second, the US needs to develop a tailored data denial strategy to curb the flow of sensitive US and allied data to China that can be exploited by the CCP. The case of TikTok and its Chinese-based parent, ByteDance, is an important and urgent policy test given mounting reports of exposure of US user data to the regime in China. The late Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo back in 2019 put forward a blueprint that he called data free flow with trust. This should become the basis for a new allied data policy. The United States and its allies and partners must promote enhanced data sharing among themselves while simultaneously limiting the dangerous data flows to China. Fourth, the United States should consider ways to restrict the sale of Americans' sensitive personal data to high-risk entities, including those controlled by or subject to the influence of the CCP. Fifth, and penultimately, Congress should encourage the adoption of standards for the protection of sensitive personal data held in the private sector. Sixth and last, apply cyber data management throughout the federal government. The fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act required what it called the development of a policy and processes that secure the routing infrastructure within the Department of Defense. Congress should pass new legislation that mandates this cyber data management provision for the entire federal government, not just for the Department of Defense. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pottinger. Mr. Klein.
Chairman Coons, Ranking Member Sass, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. For decades, American policy has sought to preserve the ideal of a borderless global internet. That was a noble vision, and it remains an attractive and instructive one in many ways. But the world has changed, and our policy needs to change with it. Most importantly, data flows must reflect geopolitics. Germany's experience in the wake of Russia's invasion with Ukraine, having to scramble to replace natural gas that was unwisely imported from Russia for years, is an illustration. We should be thinking today about what we might wish to change tomorrow if the world changes dramatically in a moment. We face intense competition from the People's Republic of China. Our military leaders have warned that this could lead to war this decade, and we know that China can use our personal data to hurt us in many ways, which have already been discussed by the other witnesses and by both of you in your opening statements. It seems to me that this is a matter of considerable urgency if, as our military leaders tell us, this situation could come to a head at any moment. We should stop feeding this data to our adversaries, but we can't simply replace the idea of a global borderless internet with a balkanized internet dominated by data localization. It's also important to preserve innovation and commerce. And so the question is, what principles should we use to replace the open borderless internet? I agree that data free flow with trust proposed by Shinzo Abe is a great illustration of the type of principles that we should adopt. In contradistinction, the European idea of an adequacy regime where we judge whether data can flow to other countries based on their domestic privacy regulation seems like something that the United States, with our focus on openness and innovation, should avoid. A few ways to implement this principle. First, the most urgent problem is Chinese companies that can help their governments gather sensitive information about Americans. This is data that, as Professor Landau said, is leaving through the front door. That includes apps, most notably TikTok. It also includes something that hasn't been mentioned yet today, which is internet-connected devices, which can monitor what goes on in our homes and other highly sensitive locations. And as researchers have documented, many of these devices send data back to servers in China. We know how power works in China. If the Communist Party decides that it wants an American's data, the company will provide it, and we shouldn't be tripped up by the intricacies of the laws that purportedly regulate such access. Second, ultimately, Congress is going to have to step in and provide a regime to empower the executive branch to control these data flows. We've seen in the litigation around some of the TikTok executive orders that there are potential statutory obstacles to comprehensive regulation here. Only Congress can put this geopolitical criterion for data flows on firm statutory footing. And the last point, consumer data brokers are, as the other witnesses have said, ultimately a national security issue. And even a prohibition on selling to foreign powers ultimately will not be sufficient. If our private information is for sale, foreign intelligence agencies are sophisticated enough to find a way to buy it. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Look forward to our first and likely second round as well. And I appreciate all of your perspectives on the threats posed by our adversaries' data collection efforts. So let me just start by exploring the methods that hostile actors are using to obtain this data and the ways that they benefit from it, just to sort of lay the groundwork. Professor Landau, your testimony laid out the different kinds of sensitive data internet service providers and app operators collect and then sell to data brokers. Could you just give a sense of the kind of detailed personal information that could reasonably be expected to be available in one of these online profiles available for sale about me, about you, about Senator Sass, about our kids, about anybody currently in the audience?
Sure. So the most most important issue is your location. So GPS data, of course, tracks you where you go outside. But GPS data, you can shut off. You can click your phone and say you're not giving GPS data to this app and that app. But you may be using your Wi-Fi on your phone, and then the various companies have collected where Wi-Fi routers are. And so when your phone pings to connect to a Wi-Fi router, the Wi-Fi router will pick up which phone it was that that did so, and of course, but that information, your phone is using. Sorry, let me try this again. Your phone is going through an IP address. The companies, the data brokers, the apps, in some cases the apps, have collections of data on where the Wi-Fi routers are, not just in the Senate, not just in the House, not just in Washington, but in Seattle and in San Francisco and in London and everywhere else. And so they know where you go. They have precise locations of where you go inside as well as outside.
And to your point, and I appreciate your detailing some of the mechanics, that allows the development over time of a very robust individual profile that, when connected with other commercially available data through the front door, as you said, allows you to come up with a profile that tells all sorts of things about relationships, about health, about acquisitions, consumer data, political views, activities of all kinds that we assume are private are not in any way private. Is that correct?
That's correct. Your conversation says what you want to do. Where you go says what you're doing, to put it bluntly.
Mr. Klein, if I might, is there anything in U.S. law at all that prevents a data broker from selling complex, rich data sets on every American to foreign entities? And in particular, if a foreign intelligence agency wanted to purchase these data sets to match up against covertly acquired or scraped or stolen data, would the government or even the data broker know that it was a foreign intelligence service that was the end purchaser?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I'm an expert in national security law, not consumer data privacy, but my understanding is that traditionally there are certain categories of data, for example, health data covered under HIPAA, educational data covered under FERPA, which I deal with in my day job, that have heightened handling standards applied to them, but that we do not, as has widely been discussed, have a general data privacy regime that limits where data can go and how it can be used outside of those specific sectors. As to your second question, I think that's an absolutely critical one. We have to credit our adversaries with the intelligence and resourcefulness that we expect from our own intelligence agencies. And so if I were a foreign intelligence agency and I wanted to purchase a highly sensitive data set from a data broker, I wouldn't simply walk up to the front door and knock and announce that I'm here from the Ministry of State Security. I might hypothetically create a front company, maybe one based in a friendly neighboring country that looks more innocuous to facilitate the transaction. And of course, we should hope that our data brokers have patriotic intentions, but of course they also have economic incentives to make the sale and limited wherewithal to undertake diligence. And so we should assume that as long as this data is for sale, our adversaries will find a way to get it.
Mr. Pottinger, it's clear, I think, to all of us that a Chinese company can be compelled by the CCP to produce any data sets in their possession. And we know China has illicitly obtained huge amounts of sensitive information through hacks of OPM and Equifax and others that have been referenced. How would an adversary like China specifically use this information in ways that undermine the United States, our interests, and would weaken our nation?
Thank you, Senator and Mr. Chairman. As you were just hearing, there's the ability to target individuals, which should concern us, and you heard some examples of that. This wellspring of data that emerges from all of us through our digital activity. I mean, it's our health records. It can be our genetic sequences, online preferences, what we read, what we watch, what we buy, financial records, legal documents, supply chains for our businesses, and not to mention all the terabytes of imagery that are produced by our phones and by our self-driving automobiles and by drones and so forth. But there's a second component to this that's also very important, and that is that the data that's being accumulated in aggregate gives important demographic information to the Chinese government about public opinion and how to predict popular topics and how to, therefore, through those popular topics, manipulate public opinion. So we should be under no illusion that there are private companies in China. I mean, if you look at a company like ByteDance, for example, which is the parent company of TikTok, it's really not a private company. It's really a hybrid. It may have started as a private company, but what we see now is that the cooperation between nominally once private companies in China and the Communist Party is becoming systemic. And it involves not only campaigns by the Communist Party to do what they call party building within nominally private companies, but also the Communist Party is now taking shareholding stakes and giving itself veto authority over important parts of these companies. So the founder of ByteDance last year stepped down. He was the CEO and chairman and founder. He stepped down amid a major crackdown on private enterprise. And from what I have read, the editor-in-chief of ByteDance, the parent of TikTok, doubles as the Communist Party secretary for that company.
Pretty striking. I'll close this round, Ms. Sachs, if I might. Some in Congress are proposing banning the transfer of data to adversaries by using export controls to regulate data transactions to adversarial nations' jurisdictions. What kinds of data leakage do you think could be addressed using an export control model? Not all data is equally sensitive. How would you scope that kind of data protection? And what do you think are the benefits and limits of this kind of an approach?
Thank you for your question. I think that when it comes to protecting data, the most effective way to do it is to focus on the data itself rather than the country of origin or where the data is going to. And just to give a concrete example, if we think about banning data flows to specific countries, at the same time, data brokers, as other witnesses have pointed out, could openly sell it anywhere in the world or to criminals at home. So I think that the export control model is one to be considered, but the most effective way to actually secure the data, I think, is going to have to take a sort of more country agnostic approach.
And is that implicit in the phrase data free flow with trust, focusing on data rather than jurisdiction?
Right, and looking at how to protect the safeguards around how the data is transferred and what type of data we're talking about as well.
Thank you. Senator Sass?
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Pottinger, let's stay with where you last were in what you said about the move toward trying to control where some of the data is located, and maybe you could help educate the American people on what it means that these two most recently passed pieces of legislation in China pretend that therefore the data is going to be secured. The PRC's new data law says, for instance, that unlimited control over data and entities that process it down to the government, even if located overseas. And yet TikTok is trying to tell us that moving their data to the US means that therefore the CCP would no longer be able to exploit TikTok data. Can you just help the American public understand what actually changes when this TikTok data moves to the US? Is there any more protection?
Thanks, Senator. What it really means is that companies that are operating in China really cannot say no. There's, the Communist Party can come to them at any time and make them an offer they can't refuse. They have to hand over, not only give them access to their data, but under these new laws, Beijing effectively becomes the controller of that data. So you may remember when last summer, the company Didi Chuxing, this was Didi, is a rideshare company. It's sort of the Uber of China. They were planning and actually went forward with an IPO in the United States. And then on the backside of it, they were rectified, to use the regulatory term. And Beijing came in, shut down, made it impossible to download the app because Beijing had determined that some of the rideshare info was probably sensitive. And they actually admitted, the government in Beijing admitted that they sent in the Ministry of State Security, which is China's KGB, into the offices to effectively take control of Didi's data. So your data is no longer your own if you're generating that data in China, or if you are a company that touches Chinese matters or Chinese citizens anywhere in the world, China can come in and say, that's ours as well. So there's a second part of this too, which is that the algorithms, which are, as I mentioned, the secret sauce that allows these apps to become so addictive, social media apps to become so addictive, those algorithms are now expressly regulated by the party state in Beijing. And in fact, they've just recently gone through a process of having all of the social media companies come in and unveil their secret sauce to explain how the algorithms work, what they do, what they don't do. So this is the first step toward giving Beijing a bird's eye view and ultimately control of the cockpit over social media algorithms, which at the end of the day are what decide what we see and what we don't see, what tens or even more than 100 million Americans see or don't see on their social media feeds.
Thanks. Mr. Klein, you in your opening statement explained some of the downsides to data localization strategies as a response, and you advocated for a presumption of the free flows of data among friendly nations for both national security and economic competitiveness reasons. Could you walk us through a little bit more about how friendshoring would work in practice?
Thank you, Senator, and I greatly appreciate your mention of the term friendshoring. I think that's an idea with a very promising future. As I mentioned, we've seen with Germany in the wake of this invasion that economic linkages have to be evaluated in the shadow of future geopolitical contingencies. If we find ourselves in a Taiwan contingency with China next week, 2 months, God forbid, we will regret immediately not having taken some of these steps that we're talking about here today. And it's not just the availability of the data, it's also, as Mr. Pottinger mentioned, the algorithm and the ways that could potentially be tweaked to amplify pro-China messaging, pacifist messaging, messages that might send panic through the American population in the event of the war. Some of these scenarios might sound far-fetched, but these are the things that I would do if I were in the cockpit over there. Glad I'm not. And so we have to consider them as very real possibilities today. To your point, the European Union, and I don't want to get too deep into the intricacies of data privacy law here, but has a regime where they require something called adequacy. And if your country is not adequate, it becomes much more difficult to transfer data out of the EU to that country. And as many people here may know, the United States and Europe have been involved in amicable but still challenging legal wrangling over whether we, Europe's closest ally, are adequate. And this has created a lot of uncertainty for American and European businesses. Now, I think that being the center of the global internet and innovation has been a great thing for us. And we should be very cautious about tampering with that and throwing up walls for data transfers. So I don't think this adequacy model is a great one. I propose instead a geopolitical criterion. Is there a real chance that flows of data between the United States and another country are going to disadvantage us in a geopolitical competition with an adversary? And we are fortunate to have many allies in this world, many countries with whom we are on friendly enough terms that we should be open to commerce with them. The number of countries with whom we should consider throwing up walls and preventing the flow of data is very small. But as I think everyone here recognizes, the stakes are also incredibly high with respect to that small group, and so we need to act with some urgency.
I have some follow-on questions, but I'm at time, so I'll wait till the next round.
Mr. Klein, if I might just follow up on that point, which I find fascinating, the idea of a very small number of countries with which we need to have high walls. Some have suggested that one of our challenges in terms of effectively approaching data security is that there's no single regulator in the United States that have either streamlined processes, sufficient resources, or enough regulatory power. Do we need a data security regulator in the United States? And how would you go about having the delineation of those nations who are sufficiently hostile enough from a data resource perspective as to justify the high walls?
Thank you, Senator. So having been tangentially involved in and, of course, studying and teaching my students about the restructuring of the national security state after 9/11, the creation of DHS, the DNI, all of these things that you all know about, and how wrenching that was. It was necessary, but it was a very wrenching and time-consuming process. And so those of us who have been around Washington long enough know that that moving boxes around on a chart is never as quick and simple as we think it might be. So I'm always hesitant to propose new institutions, new agencies as the solution. And certainly we've seen the FCC and the FTC at times moving energetically on particular aspects of this problem. Ultimately, only Congress can really resolve this because, as I mentioned, there are various legal barriers that that jump up to what seem like good remedies to things like the TikTok problem. And so a statute is ultimately the only sustainable basis. Now, you asked, how do we know which countries should be in there? Some of them are pretty easy. Right? We all agree that the People's Republic of China is our systemic competitor, the biggest threat. The pacing threat, as the Department of Defense calls it. And of course, the Russian Federation is another country that, at least under its current regime, is implacably hostile to the United States and our values. So there's some low-hanging fruit, and there are a few other lesser rivals that would also fall into that category. So the short answer is some of these should be covered by statute, and it may be wise to include a designation mechanism by which the Secretary of State, perhaps in coordination with Commerce, could name additional countries.
Thank you. Ms. Sachs, if I might, do we need a federal privacy law? The EU's got GDPR. Could we come up with a better approach than the adequacy standard of the GDPR? Could we come up with a federal data privacy standard that goes across, so it's not just siloed into financial data or to personal health data, but that actually accomplishes the data protection that would then be required for us to have more confidence in the free flow of data with all but a very small handful of authoritarian states?
Absolutely. Efforts to protect Americans' data security has to start with a comprehensive federal privacy law. And then the question is, how do we think about questions like international transfers to third countries? And to your question earlier about the data export control regime, I think a more effective way to get at this might be to actually think about models for transfers to third countries, but in ways that remove geopolitics from the equation and come up with a range of determinations that would be risk-based approach to evaluate the data regimes of the recipient countries. And there are a number of models that merit further study. I think that I agree with my co-panelists that avoiding a sort of country by country adequacy determination would probably be the best way. I think that the EU has some practical challenges that would be difficult for the US to implement, but I do recommend looking at the UK model, for example, which provides a little bit more flexibility. But there are certainly ways to study what would an international transfers regime look like in the context of comprehensive federal privacy.
My last two questions. Is there an opportunity here for us to harmonize with the UK and the EU and set a different, I would argue, higher standard that shows the benefits of a robust, innovative, global, connected data marketplace while increasing data protections? Is that something we still have the chance to do? I'll just pose that to the whole panel and then yield to my ranking member.
Absolutely. And it's something that we've seen out of the cybersecurity office of the White House saying that this would be a benefit in terms of both privacy but also national security. It would be, right now Europe is using privacy as a cudgel against us economically. So doing it would actually be beneficial economically as well as for national security.
I agree, and I think if we don't, we are ceding leadership to both Europe, to China, and the rest of the world in setting these standards for technologies for the future.
I agree.
Mr. Chairman, I do think that some kind of a domestic governance framework is warranted. And I remember that the Cyber Space Solarium Commission made a recommendation to Congress to pass what they called a national data security and privacy protection law, establishing and standardizing requirements for the collection, retention, and sharing of user data. I do think something like that is warranted. I'm not sure that it's exactly the European model. It's probably going to be different given our own traditions toward free speech for one thing, but I do think that we can come closer to where the Europeans are, to the point that Susan and Sam made. I don't want to see the United States cede leadership. I want us to get past this this sort of impasse that we have with the Europeans, and to do it in a way that that works well for the U.S. and for our industry.
My strong impression is that by failing to act legislatively, we are ceding leadership. Mr. Klein, why don't you close, and then I'll yield to Senator Sass.
I think we all agree that a comprehensive data privacy legislation would be beneficial for national security as well. We also want to remember that we have led the development of the global internet for a reason. It's that we allow entrepreneurs to create, to develop transnational business models, to innovate. So privacy legislation has to reflect that American bias toward innovation, which we don't want to lose.
Thanks. Continuing from there, Professor Klein, obviously Chairman Xi has already gathered an unbelievable amount of PII on Americans, and that's not just going to evaporate because we got more effective at your idea of friend shoring and other ways to allow free flow among trusted neighbors and nations. What's a reasonable way to think about where we could be 5 years from now? You mentioned the rise of, counterterrorism bureaucracies after 9/11, and 9/11 happened 7 months into President W43's first term, and most of the laws weren't passed until 2004, and most of the bureaucracies weren't stood up till 2005, 2006, and they weren't functioning well for another 3 or 4 years after that. That's a decade. What can be done in the next 5 years?
Thank you, Senator. I think we have to be somewhat modest about how completely we can seal off these leaks. I think of it as a bucket with 50 holes in it. And a lot of them are small. They're pinpricks, and we can't close every pinprick. But the giant hole in the bottom, we can close. And so, for example, allowing them to take data out the front door through apps that collect huge amounts of data on Americans is something we should do now. And people might say, well, if the data is stored overseas or in loosely secured data centers, they can still find a way in. That's true, but let's make them work for it. Let's make them, for example, send a human intelligence officer to a third country and try to gain access to a data center. That's a lot harder than simply bringing it out through an app or buying a data broker. Let's force them to burn some zero-day vulnerabilities to get into these treasure troves instead of just taking it out of the front door or from the loading dock on the back of a truck. That carries its own risks for them, operational security risk. They'd have to give up valuable capabilities potentially, and they'll have to weigh whether that data is valuable enough to warrant risking these other intelligence tools on. Let's put them to the test and force them to do hard things to get this data instead of making it so incredibly easy.
Same question to you, Mr. Pottinger. What's doable inside the first 5 years? And if there are 50 leaks in the bucket, what do you prioritize as task 1 and 2?
Yeah, I do think that we could make a lot of progress. I agree with everything that Adam just said, but also on that data free flow with trust. I think we failed to just take the bull by the horns. Prime Minister Abe came forward with a basic but elegant kind of framework that, in essence, says countries that enjoy the rule of law and other countries that want to work within an environment where the rule of law is respected, where privacy is respected, should be pooling data in ways that make that data useful for our technological advances, and in ways that respect privacy, where some of that metadata, the telemetry, and so forth are not exposed and identified with individuals. I really think that we need to take the lead on this. I know that the State Department has a new ambassador at large position, someone that I know, in fact, has been nominated for that job. That would be a very useful sort of endeavor to start taking leadership on the allied response. So it's not merely a U.S. response on that. The other would be, I think, really on the CFIUS side and really energizing the ICTS process. Remember, ICTS, this Information Communications Technology and Services regime, was something that sprung from an executive order signed by President Trump, and then also renewed and advanced further by President Biden's executive order. But we haven't heard anything from them since. It's been a few years now. And what this thing is designed to do, it's a little bit like CFIUS, but whereas CFIUS monitors inbound investment to make sure that investment does not threaten U.S. national security. The ICTS process examines inbound technology, software, apps from adversary states, first and foremost China, to ensure that those technologies and apps and software and equipment into our IT systems do not threaten our national security. I think there's a chance for that process to be energized. I think Congress is going to have to do it with your gavels and just call hearings and find out why we haven't heard anything from ICTS in the 3 years since it was created.
Thank you, Senator Sass. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Coons, Senator Sass, for holding this very important hearing. And I appreciate the testimony from our witnesses. I guess I'll start with you, Ms. Sachs. We have no idea how foreign-owned platforms might be tailoring recommendation algorithms to target messages to Americans. I have a few guesses for some of them. We need more transparency, and I have been proud to team up with Chair Coons and Senator Portman on a bill called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act to require these digital platforms to give independent verified researchers access to data with appropriate privacy protections. Yesterday, I asked the whistleblower, the Twitter whistleblower, about this question, about if that would be helpful. As a researcher, and I'll ask you this as well, Professor Landau, as researcher, can you speak to how you might be able to use this kind of data effectively?
I'm sorry, can you clarify what kind of data?
Well, it is the independent, it's access to data within the platforms. It's data that the platforms would use to determine their algorithms and the like.
Right. I think this kind of data, insight, psychology, behavior-driven data, can be used to tailor disinformation. And I think there are threats at home and abroad in terms of how that can be used to push out content that can persuade Americans of whether it's Chinese propaganda or whether it's misinformation about pandemics or elections. And so I commend your work on algorithmic transparency in this area.
Professor Landau?
I think it's absolutely essential. The data scientists in the academic research field have been clamoring for this for a long time already. They have access, for example, people have access to census data with protections on the census data so that people's private information is not released. And this is absolutely essential because we need to know, how are they working? Are there foreign influences on there? Are the algorithms fair? Are they just? And we don't know these things. And only by examining the data flows and so on can researchers actually measure it.
Very good. Thank you. As chair of the Rules Committee, I've made election security one of my priorities, working across the aisle with Senator Langford, doing work on things like backup paper ballots. And this summer, Senator Reid and I urged our intelligence agencies to prepare for the threat of Russian disinformation and cyber attacks ahead of the midterm elections. We've just recently learned about the huge amount of money that they have spent internationally on election issues. And in 2016, we know that Russia brought targeted digital ads on Facebook, reaching an estimated 126 million people on Facebook alone. We know that because they bought many of the ads with rubles. Can you tell us more about how foreign adversaries like Russia have obtained user data for targeting their disinformation campaigns in the past? Are we even able to detect when they are using legal methods like scraping public profiles to obtain data?
How the Russians are doing it is probably really an answer for the question for the intelligence agencies. But the question I can answer is how much data is available. And the answer is set up, as Adam has said, set up an ad broker, not in Moscow, but set it up in perhaps Italy, perhaps somewhere else, and start buying data from the United States. There are, 2 weeks ago, the Federal Trade Commission launched a civil complaint against an ad broker that was releasing data on 61 million unique devices, 7 days worth of data with sensitive information. That kind of sensitive information, if it's a staff member of yours or a relative of yours discovering information that they've been homeless, they've gone to a drug treatment facility, that can put pressure on people in ways that are very dangerous for the United States. So they're getting data in a variety of ways is the answer.
Okay. And what should we be doing, in your view, to protect Americans from this kind of targeting?
Well, we should start by increasing, this goes back to a question that Senator Sass was asking about what regulator is in a position to be able to, what agency within the federal government, or how do we approach protecting data? And I'm drawn back to what Senator Sass said a few moments ago about the
I'm
problems.
always drawn back to what Senator Sass says.
When he talked about how long it took post-September 11th before we got agencies that were actually working and functional. One of the things we didn't do on September 11th, at post-September 11th, which turned out to be a great thing not to do, was we didn't move the Computer Security Division from NIST over to DHS. And the result was that it grew and it functioned and it did much better. And why I bring that up right now is we have a problem with the FTC, but the problem is not with the FTC. The problem is with its scope of regulatory authority and the amount of funding it has. The FTC is actually doing a very good job on privacy with the limited resources it has.
Yes.
And so if we think about what's the thing we should do, we should increase its regulatory authority. So right now it's forced to go on harms, and harms are typically economic. The kinds of harms you're describing, Senator Klobuchar, are not economic, they're different. So we need to change the scope of its regulatory authority, and we need to fund it properly so it can do the job that you all are saying needs to be done in terms of securing Americans' data.
Along those lines, Senator Grassley and I had a bill to change the merger fees, the way they're structured, to bring more money to the Justice Department and the FTC, passed here unanimously, passed the Senate, and then is stuck over in the House for reasons I don't know. I will ask my other questions on the record. I'm out of time. Mr. Klein, I have a very good question for you. Thank you for being here, as well as of Mr. Pottinger. So thank you very much, all of you, for this really good hearing.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you. I am just so surprised that Senator Klobuchar didn't ask one of our favorite questions, is why we need to pass a federal privacy standard.
That was my next question, but I didn't want to go on your time.
Well, there you go. There you go. So, Ms. Sachs, I want to come to you. Give us about 30 seconds on why we need to pass a federal privacy, federal data security standard and have one set of rules for the entire ecosystem, one regulator properly funded, properly set up. Go ahead.
Right now, Americans' data is shockingly exposed, and it's exposed to foreign adversaries as well as data brokers and unregulated private companies. So we need baseline standards on collection, retention, and as well as who has access to that data. That will go a long way.
Utilization.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for that. Mr. Klein, let me come to you. I want to ask about the new IP and the ITU's push for this. Of course, we know Huawei has pushed for the new IP. Concerned about this coming back up at the next meeting. Could you give me your take on that, please?
So I think thank you, Senator, for the question. To me, what this illustrates is that control over the architecture of the global internet is now very much up for grabs. And I think this is becoming widely realized. Perhaps we could do more and be more energetic. I agree that the new ambassador at large position will be a great step there. But we as the United States need to have an alternative model for what the internet looks like in the future. We have held on for a long time to this idea of a borderless internet. And unfortunately, because we now face this intense competition with China and to a lesser degree other authoritarian powers, it no longer works. We need to have another vision that we can unify our allies around. And I agree with the many people today who have said that data free flow with trust, this idea to come out of Japan, is a very promising model for that. That data should move freely, that innovation should be possible, but among friendly countries that share basic rule of law commitments.
And I think that many of these countries, whether you're talking about the EU, the UK, you're talking about Canada, they're waiting for us to take a move because cross-border transfers are indeed important. Mr. Pottinger, let me come to you. Talking about standard-setting bodies, we've seen China push to try to gain advantage in the sector using standard-setting bodies. So during your time in the Trump administration, did you witness this, and to what extent?
Senator, a great question. What we saw over the course of our time in office, and certainly that's continuing now, is that the Chinese Communist Party has become very effective at expanding its influence and really co-opting international organizations, including standard-setting bodies, not by giving them money, which is what the U.S. does. We're usually the number one funder of a lot of these organizations, like the World Health Organization and so forth, but rather by marshaling support from countries that Beijing, for example, lends money to have them vote in Chinese candidates in one of 4 positions. The director level job. So, and these are usually Communist Party officials who end up taking these jobs at UN or other international standards setting bodies. So they go after the director and deputy director roles, but they also go after the personnel, the human resources departments, so that they can control who comes in to work at low level and medium level jobs in those organizations. They come in to take control of the IT department, like we saw at the Food and Agriculture Organization, where as soon as a Chinese official took over FAO, they immediately threw out all the old IT and replaced it with Huawei systems so that the Chinese government can monitor everything that's going on within that organization and beyond. And the last one is the General Counsel's Office. So it's always been an oxymoron that a Chinese Communist Party official who comes from a non-rule of law society would have any legal role in any international organization, but they find their way in to a lot of these organizations, like we saw at the Civil Aviation Organization up in Montreal. So this is a battleground where we need to realize that we've been outflanked in many cases. Doesn't mean that Americans need to be in those roles, but certainly we need to campaign, horse trade, or organize the way that we campaign to get like-minded countries on board, so that we can have people from countries that are reliably supportive of the rule of law to come in and help enforce those standards. This is a big battleground. This is another one where my old friend Nathaniel Fick, who I think has been is up for being approved by the Senate to go into a role working on international cyber issues. This would be a big task for him and his staff, but it's one that needs White House participation and oversight at all times.
Thank you for that. I'm going to send you one other question for a response, written response. I want to talk to you about click-through ads and how they're using the ad stack. Some of our adversaries are misusing that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, everyone, for helping advise us on this. I just wanted to talk about data brokers and the private sector's collection of Americans' data. They've gotten very good at it. It seems to me that they've got a lot more data on us than the government will ever dream of having. And if you're a foreign government, you want to get data on Americans, here we have data brokers who are more or less ready to sell it. And I don't believe that our restrictions on international sale of Americans' data are adequate. And I don't believe that we have very good methods for defeating efforts to get around any restrictions, given the ability of folks to hide behind phony front groups and run requests, from one shell corporation through another shell corporation, hell, through a Dakota trust. And by the time you're done, it all looks pretty American, but you don't know who's on the real other side of it. So what advice would you give for us? I'm the Judiciary Committee member who was supporting Ron Wyden's bill in this space. So if there are any thoughts you have about that in particular, that would be helpful. But it strikes me that we've let the data mining and selling industry grow like weeds without any real restraint or constraint. And we should be presuming that our international rivals and adversaries are having essentially free access to all of that. So if you don't mind, Ms. Sachs first, Professor Landau, Mr. Klein, Mr. Pottinger, in 3 minutes.
Well, I understand that there are some real challenges around federal privacy law. I think one of the first more near-term things we can do is put transparency and controls in place that would stop this gap, which is the flow of data on the open market through data brokers. So I commend the proposals that are underway to close that loophole.
Stop it.
Yeah.
Professor?
So I look at it as a scientist in part. And as a scientist in part, I see, well, as I talked about earlier, if I think that it's really, well, this is outside of scientists, it's really important for our security to have us work with our allies. And right now, GDPR protects certain kinds of data that we do not, and doesn't allow the collection or requires it to be treated as personal information. So that change increases security. But the other part is requiring the increase of security of data, these data brokers. The FTC, as I've said earlier, is underfunded, and we need to increase the security. There's also, why is the data being retained for as long as it's being retained? Because that, of course, increases the security risk. So I would start with both thinking about it as a national security level, that is, how do we work with our allies and how do we do data privacy at a national security level? And I would also think of it as a computer security question. How do we secure the data? And those are the things I would think of, to the extent that they're not part of the bill already. That's where I'd go.
Thanks. Mr. Klein?
Thank you, Senator. And I certainly agree with the thrust of the question, which is that if it is for sale, it will be bought by people we don't want to have it. We have to operate on that presumption. And so regulating data brokers by telling them not to sell to bad people will not be an effective solution. The business model itself is fundamentally a national security threat.
Thanks. And Mr. Pottinger?
Senator, I do agree that the business model is the problem, and we've seen this this sort of untenable situation where something like GDPR, which ends up restricting and regulating companies that actually abide by European law, does not really affect Chinese-owned apps, which are under pressure to abide by Chinese Chinese laws as opposed to those in a rule of law society like Europe. So we need to be realistic about the nature of the system in Beijing, and cannot assume that Chinese-owned apps are actually going to follow the letter or the spirit of European or American law.
You know, it makes me wonder, is this one of those things where as long as everybody's doing it, I feel I've got to do it, and therefore I'm going to go to data brokers and buy data, but if we got rid of the whole damn thing, we'd actually all be better off? What's the case for massive private collection of data on other Americans for commercial purposes? Okay, long pause, understood. It's an articulate answer all by itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Any further questions, Senator Sens? Nope. And I will say to your closing point there, there is a compelling competitive business case, but there are huge national security and personal privacy challenges, and we need to do more in this space. I look forward.
Just to that point, there's a competitive business case once you allow this to happen.
Correct.
Because you can't give one business the advantage of using this data and others not. But that's a different thing than saying that it's actually good for anybody or for the country to have this nonsense happening as a business proposition.
Agreed. I look forward to working with my colleague, Senator Sass, on a proposal that is targeted at government contractors. Senator Klobuchar mentioned the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act that Senator Portman, Senator Klobuchar, and I have been trying to advance that is principally about understanding algorithms and ensuring access for academic research. I am frustrated, as I know are many of my colleagues who referenced it, at the lack of progress, despite many years of trying on a federal standard for data privacy that might then help facilitate plugging up these holes, not just those along the sides of the bucket, but the massive hole at the bottom of the data bucket that's being currently gathered. So
thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.